Ladies and gentlemen, is Cush Anna Brodul Dom Vet Os for Core in Laurelon Colul Ulskol Maynooth Anocht. It's a proud moment to be standing in the celebrated library of Maynooth University. That said, it's not without apprehension that I came here tonight. When I viewed the programme that Terry Dooley and Kieran and Elaine and colleagues had put together, and I looked at the academic firepower of the first talk, courtesy of Professor Lyons. I looked at the firepower of a more realistic kind brought by Seamus Cullen, who had you all looking for pieces of shrapnel around the facades of Maynooth the following week. And then I considered the charming itinerary through the mansions, rooms and bedrooms of the Fitzgerald dynasty that Colette brought to us last week, that I'm just an utter anticlimax. And my only saving grace was how lucky I am to have a chair as gracious as Susan Jurek, the doyenne of the creative arts in the Maynooth area. But, you know, before we're all into technology and PowerPoints and all the rest of it, I want to remind you of a little piece of old technology. Anybody see one of these in recent times? I'm not sure, was it sha sha or niha niha or sha niha or niha sha? I'm not sure. But it's I suppose, very appropriate nonetheless that I'm able to speak to you on the rare occasion of the calendar falling between two electoral events. The referendum just passed and the next local elections, which are likely to take place on or about the 7th of June. Now, there's at least two people in the audience here, and I refer to Councillors Angela Feeney and Brendan Wise, who will be counting the hours and the minutes to that particular date when it's announced. And the rest of us will all get to play our part in that democratic process. A democratic process that had its origins 125 years ago as we sit here tonight. The first occasion that most Irish people, and certainly Irish women, had the opportunity to engage with that piece of electoral hardware. The fin de siècle, the last years of the 19th century in Ireland and in Kildare in particular, could be summarised, I suppose, along the lines of that the political mobilisation of land and nationalist agitation, which had convulsed Ireland in the earlier part of the 19th century, did not affect Kildare with the militancy seen in other parts. Yet the county's legacy of its leading role in the 1798 rebellion had not been forgotten. And on the agrarian front, the Clongowry evictions near Newbridge, which saw upwards of 50 householders evicted from their holdings in the early 1890s, still touched a raw nerve. It was against that background that a Westminster Parliament transferred a new measure for the local government of Ireland to this country, and for our purposes to County Kildare. And they achieved that through a piece of legislation known as the 1898 Local Government Ireland Act. And I have a copy of the original statutes of that year. And an act for amending the law relating to local government Ireland and for other purposes connected therewith. And it runs to over 120 sections, but the first one stipulates, a council shall be established in every county and be entrusted with the administrative and financial business of that county and shall consist of a chairman and councillors. And that piece of legislation passed in Westminster in the August of 1898 has set a map for Ireland that, notwithstanding our own journey to national independence, is still very familiar to us in the present day. Now, the Act covered a lot of things, as well as the local government structures and financing and staffing and so on. There was a clause in it regarding the provision of ballot boxes and so on, and another one regulating the licensing of bicycles, which has produced a line in many a drama put on in halls around the country. But nonetheless, it set up a map for the local politics and local management of the country that is familiar today. But let's just look at my subtitle for a moment. While I know our talks are to be very universal in terms of their theme, I've noticed that the previous speakers always honed in on the immediate Maynooth area, and I will try and do the same as we go through. And I thought this was a lovely quote: "A disgrace and a blot on the fair name of Maynooth," and we'll reveal the substance behind that quote a little bit later. So here is our Westminster Parliament and the opening clauses of that 1898 Local Government Act, which, despite many reforms in local government in Ireland, how it's managed, how it's financed, functions given to it, functions taken from it, is still in play today as regards the geography of public affairs in Ireland. But let's step back a little bit. What preceded it? So we had a patchwork, I suppose, of local government entities. The longest established at this stage was known as the Grand Jury. So we have a map of Kildare here from 1837 and subdivided into what were known as the baronies. And Maynooth is in the barony of North Salt. Now, I have to say, when I first started reading about history, I couldn't for the life of me understand what salt meant in this context. And it was only somebody much wiser than me explained that it's derived from our neighbouring town of Leixlip, which takes its name from the Old Norse of Leixlip, salmon leap. The Latin for leap is salt, as in summer salt. So hence the barony of North Salt and South Salt residing within County Kildare. And other baronies with lovely old Irish names like Keithy and Uachtarani and so on. So the Grand Jury, and we'll have a look of who comprised it, were not elected at all. They were appointed from the top down. The Lord Lieutenant appointed the county sheriffs appointed the members of the Grand Jury. And as the name suggests, their first role was in terms of courts and criminal hearings and so on. And then they realised that if the King's writ was to operate, well, you needed things like courthouses and prisons. And if the King's constabulary were to march around the county to enforce the writ, you needed things like roads and bridges. And after a while, that became almost more important to them than the judicial side of it. Now, I know I'm preaching to converted, and people like Terry Dooley and Kieran Riley and others will know so much. But just to take on your left-hand side there is a copy of what we call the presentments, or the schedule of proposed works of the Grand Jury in 1893. And the Grand Jury, if you like, committee. And just to pluck out some of the names: George Mansfield from Morristown Latin near Newbridge, Major St. Ledger Moore from Killashee Hotel, I should probably know it in the modern era, Hugh Henry from Straffan Lodge, and so on. Very much the elite in society at the time. And the way they operated was that interested parties would put forward proposals for jobs or tasks or whatever, mending roads, repairing bridges, and the Grand Jury would pass what was called a presentment and said, right, we levy this on a type of rate known as the county cess. So now there's a lot of print in my slides because I want you to, if you like, see the sources, but don't worry, I'll go through everything so you won't miss out on anything. So circled in red, we have a presentment for Michael Dawson of Maynooth to repair 408 perches of road and footpath between Maynooth Chapel, out to us here, and Lara Bryan Crossroads. in 1893 for £25 and 10 shillings. Another one here that to the administratrix, a rare enough term, administratrix of John Denny of Baybush, 600 perches of road from Rathcoffey to Straffan between the bounds of Aikiti and Dunn's Forge. And I hadn't expected to find that, but somewhere in my lineage there are Dunns who had a forge in Rathcoffey, and I didn't expect to see them mentioned in the grand jury presentments. A second kind of local government operation that was there right through the 19th century were the poor law unions. Now, they were centred on the three workhouses, as they're popularly known, of Athy, of Naas and of Selbridge. And they were established about 1840, and so very quickly overwhelmed by the famine. But when equilibrium restored, the poor law unions were a lot of things that the grand juries were not. They were strictly audited. They were controlled centrally from the local government board in the Customs House. They had forums and procedures and regulations. And their governance, a word we use so much in the modern era, proved so strong that as government began to take more and more social responsibilities, they were allocated to the grand juries. So they became, to the poor law unions. So they became the registrars of births, marriages and deaths in 1864, public health, sanitation, the first efforts at water and sewage and so on, 1878. And the beginnings of housing, the housing of the working classes, all those little cottages that are sometimes referred to as Parnell cottages in the countryside. Many of them would have been built by the poor law unions and so on. And again, who, if you like, ran the show as regards. Now, they were somewhat more democratic, that landholders with a certain property valuation had the opportunity to vote. But nonetheless, it still remained very much with the upper layers of society. And I just take an example of the Selbridge Union meeting in May 1885, and the first three names, His Grace the Duke of Leinster was in the chair, Lord Cloncurry from Lyons House, Major Barton from Straffan House, those kinds of names, Colonel Dease from Selbridge Abbey. But also you're getting names maybe with fewer honorifics before them. There's a P. Conlon, a J. Malone, a D. Dunn. These were middle class, I suppose, farmers and so on, who had sufficient valuation to be elected on the boards. But even I spoke about their level of administration being so granular and reported, like the state of the workhouse, 142 inmates in it in that week in May 1885. 21 were admitted. None were born that week, 32 discharged. And they even come down to breaking down how much it costs to keep somebody. So, you know, the cost per head in the infirmary, 6 shillings and 10 pence for the week to feed them whatever basic sustenance and so on. And I couldn't help thinking and looking at that word house, and at the top of the tree, the Duke of Leinster in Carton House, and at the very bottom, the paupers in the workhouse. The same word in the dictionary, but two entirely different connotations. So, just a little schematic here. What this Local Government Act did was brought this patchwork, if you like, together into the organisation known as the County Council and subsidiary rural district councils. And what happened in Kildare, both organisationally and politically, was very much the same story, be it Kerry, be it Kilkenny, be it Meath or Mayo, throughout, indeed, the island of Ireland, albeit the politics in what were to become the counties of Northern Ireland perhaps somewhat different. So, from this time the elections were set for April of 1899, and from this period that year of 1899, electioneering was in full swing. So what was the method of communication? I was very interested reading hearing some of the discussion on the radio about people where they got their information for the referendum, and they were talking about TikTok and FaceTime and so on. In 1899, politics was largely communicated through public meetings and through extensive and detailed reportage in the local papers. There were 2 local papers published from within the county, the Kildare Observer from 1879, more or less the paper of the country squires. Lots of, reports from, if you like, the Kildare hunt and cricket matches and things like that. But in fairness to it was a family-owned newspapers. It had some similarities to a kind of an Irish Times for Kildare. It covered all sides of the political spectrum, a kind of a paper of record. I noticed there in the advertisements, Kieran, you'll be interested, Aylesbury's wheelwrights from Edenderry advertising there in the Kildare Observer. And when I say it gave equal billing to the different sides of the political divide, I think the Observer's finest hour was probably in the month of July 1911, when it gave equal billing in its same issue to a royal visit of George and Mary to Maynooth College, and in the same page, almost the same number of column inches to the Republican pilgrimage to Bodenstown just down the road. And just to show you a little bit about what I'm talking about, there's Mary of Tech, as she was known, with Cardinal Mannix, briefly President, Monsignor then, President of the college, later to achieve episcopal fame in Australia, and Archbishop Walsh. And on the right-hand side of the picture, it's a little bit later, 1915, at which Pádraig Pearse gave the oration. But I digress. But just to show you the role of the local papers. Then you had the Leinster Leader, and a campaigning newspaper from the World Go, from the Land League dimension, and the, I suppose, growing nationalist movement, the Irish language. Indeed, an early editor, John Wise Power, was at the same time as being editor of the Leader, also one of the founder members of the GAA, who met in Hayes' Hotel in Thurles. John Wise Power is too unusual in terms of Irish political power couples. He was married to Jenny O'Toole from Baltinglass, Jenny Wise Power, and unlike most Irish situations, she became far more famous than he did. Founder member of Cumann, founder member of Sinn Féin, member of the New Irish Senate, and he disappeared into obscurity. So let's have a look then at some of the possible, or some of the candidates, some offering themselves for election. And I suppose it's helpful to think, while there were parties, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the United Irish League, people like that, it really is most helpful to think of 2 broad movements. There were, on one side, the old guard, the unionists of one level of intensity or another, and on the other then, the Home Rulers. Many of them had come into politics through the Land League campaigns, others through association with Parnell. Some had taken one side or other of the rancorous Parnell split. But broadly speaking, they were in a Home Rule type movement. Now in 1899, no one was talking about full-blooded independence, republicanism. They might have been by the end of 1899, but not at the beginning. Home Rulers, they were thinking of a parliament in Dublin that it'd look after lots of, good stuff like agriculture, public works, education, and so on, but still sitting within a United Kingdom and an imperial framework. In any event, I have a few of the candidates who, put forward their candidacies to the electors of Kildare through the local papers. George Wolfe from Furness, it'll ring a bell. His antecedents would have given the Wolfe title to Tone, Wolfe Tone, and so on. And although George Wolfe was Protestant and a landowner, he had the backing of the Catholic clergy. The parish priest of Ballymore, Eustace, described him the scion of a grand old historic family in the land. And that was partly because George Wolfe supported a campaign for a Catholic university. Now, that might seem a little bit strange because Maynooth was here at that time as a Catholic university. But in terms of a Catholic lay university that would, if you like, rival Trinity College, that was a big part of the nationalist agenda at the time. George Wolfe, in his political career, was a lengthy one because, interestingly enough, he was elected as a Cumann na Gael TD in the new Irish state in 1927. And, you know, this is about geography as well as history, so I've just a red X just to indicate where their particular base of operation was. Thomas Cook Trench of Millicent also got a favourable endorsement from the Leinster leader, although he too was Protestant and a landlord. The Clane electors will support him, not as a politician, but as one of the ablest of the minority. Listen to the language. This is coming from the Nationalist Leinster leader. One of the ablest of the minority, to whom it is expedient to give representation. I don't have a photograph of him, but he did do his bit for the local landscape in providing the site and the funds for the lovely Church of St. Michael and All Angels at Millicent between Clane and Sallins. Edward Delaney of Faith Cullen, heading out beyond your territory, Brendan, out to the Bog of Allen there. I offer myself as a county councillor for your decision. You know my politics since the good old days of the Land League. And at the bottom is an engraving of leases of the Leinster estate being burned on a 98 pike in Kildare town. There's some symbolism. William Smith of Carbery. My political opinion on all national questions is now, and always has been, Home Rule, a Catholic university, and a complete land purchase system, and the release of all prisoners convicted of political offences. And I just have a little extract there from Cardinal Newman's papers on the Catholic University. And I just mentioned that in our modern teaching of history, we know a lot about Home Rule, we know a lot about the land purchase, but for some reason, this Catholic University, which was a really big question among nationalists at that time, has dropped out of our modern telling of the story of Ireland in the 1890s to 1910. Now, Peter Timmins of Monstrevan, he was a man who, back a few years ago, you would have said maybe had the Bertie touch. None of these big plans about Home Rule are at them. The heavy taxes on tea, on the cheaper kind of tobacco and beer, should be taken off in the interest of labourers. And a little collection of bottles there from Malik's Hotel at Garvan near the Curragh, and Clinton's establishment in Newbridge, and maybe those were some of the very bottles that Peter Timmins' electors drank from and complained about the excise on the beer. Back to the sort of the gentry again. Baron de Robic of Gordon Grange, I address you as an old friend, being settled among you for some 50 years. Interestingly enough, among all the earls and dukes and so on, de Robic, a Swedish title. Not quite sure how they ended up, but in Kildare, but in any event. Now we come closer to home. The emotive political battle between William Ronaldson, the nationalist candidate for the Maynooth Leixlip electoral division, and Lord Frederick Fitzgerald of Carton. Now I'm going to ask Colette, tell us who Frederick Fitzgerald was. I don't know too much about him.
He was the brother of the 5th Duke.
Right. He was, okay. He was left kind of looking after things a bit, was he?
The trustee.
The trustee. Okay. Thank you, Colette. So, I'll expand on that now a little bit later. Then in Monastrevan, two candidates, Dowling and Cassidy. Cassidy's distillery, the premises is still there when you drive into Monastrevan. Nothing really has been done with it over the years. A massive distillery, and he contested the rival candidate there, Dowling, for control of the local fife and drum band. Now, for Terry there or Kieran, if you have a student who's looking for a subject of a thesis, there's one to be done on the role of the fife and drum bands. As far as I can see, there was one at every corner in Ireland at the time. And if you got the control of the band, you were on a high as regards the electoral stakes, if you like. If I can just find something about it. Yeah, Monstrevan had a brush with electioneering excesses, with the rival candidates Dowling and Cassidy contesting ground. The Kildare Observer report noted, those best informed attribute the ultimate outbreak of hostilities to a narrow section who, having seized control of the local fife and drum band, which had been initially established on neutral lines, refused to allow this band to attend the meeting at Kildangan, which on this occasion was in favour of Mr. Cassidy. And then, just as an afterthought, the Observer correspondent adds, this was the first genuine Irish row witnessed in Monastrevan for a considerable number of years. You know, you think it was like this was the first heavy rain we've had in. This is the first genuine. Right. Oh, I'm back to Maynooth here, yeah. And things are also hotting up in Maynooth. A meeting was called to endorse the candidature of Mr. Ronaldson, who, despite his name, was the nationalist candidate. He lived in Leixlip. But the meeting was broken up by a howling mob whose most conspicuous features were turmoil, disorder, and drunkenness. The fact that the meeting took place on St. Patrick's Day 1899 may explain the latter vice, as the rival candidate, Lord Frederick Fitzgerald of the Great Carton family, was absolved from involvement in what the writer declared was a disgrace and a blot on the fair name of Maynooth. Now, is this the first evidence we have of election posters in County Kildare? The Leinster leader excoriated an attempt to curry favour for Lord Frederick Fitzgerald in the 1899 elections by those who put up posters invoking his descent from Lord Edward Fitzgerald. And the leader says the gentlemen responsible for the vote for the Geraldine placard, which has been exhibited extensively in the Leixlip and Maynooth districts, evidently share Carlyle's opinion that the inhabitants of these islands are mostly fools. One could understand an appeal on behalf of Lord Frederick Fitzgerald based on personal qualities, abilities and judgment, but the invocation of the name of Lord Edward Fitzgerald in a contest between a sterling advocate of Ireland's rights, such as Mr. Ronaldson, and a gentleman, Frederick Fitzgerald, who does not consider the Irish people fit for self-government, is certainly an impudent insult to the intelligence and national sentiment of the electors. So an element of sentiment towards the Fitzgeralds viewed them now as just an accessory of the imperial machinery in Ireland. Not everybody, I shall see later, felt that way, but certainly in the political currents of the end of the 19th century, that was a view of of Lord Frederick Fitzgerald's candidacy. Now we go on, and this is taken from the newspaper. There was a meeting scheduled for Ronaldson in Maynooth, and he was to give his address from a horse and dray. But supporters from Lord Frederick Fitzgerald hurried the horse and dray away before Ronaldson arrived. He was in good company. Something similar happened to Michael Collins in the square in Dungarvan in 1922. That's another story. In any event. So the Ronaldson supporters decamped to Leixlip. And Mr. Haviland Burke, who was received with applause, pointed out that while Mr. Ronaldson was a nationalist who was ready to devote his energies to every form of national advancement, Lord Frederick Fitzgerald was a bitter unionist, Colette, I hope you're not squirming now over this, was a bitter unionist who believed that the Irish people were not fit to be trusted with self-government. If the unionists succeeded in their endeavours to capture the county councils, he, Mr Burke, believed it would embolden them to attack the nationalist parliamentary seats, that would be the Irish parliamentary seats in Westminster, at the next election. So the chairman then put at the meeting a vote of confidence in Mr Ronaldson, which was carried with acclamation, and the proceedings terminated. So we'll return to Ronaldson versus Fitzgerald later on. In any event, polling day was scheduled for the 6th of April of 1899. Now, it's a good job that the local government board chose that date, because there was something else happening in Kildare in the April of 1899. What else was happening in Kildare in the April of 1899? What happens every April in 1899? And with a synchronicity that's only possible when you come to the library in Maynooth, this is an original poster from April 1899. Right. So it gets across the message that sometimes forget when we're talking about high politics and history and so on, that this is what the people of Kildare were looking at, as well as the political posters. And if the local government board in Dublin had been as out of touch as some of their successors 125 years later, and set the date for the election that week, the poll might have been down in Kildare. In any event, a much more profound thing to mention, the electorate was not the people of high property valuations, but this act, as well as reforming the structure, also reformed the electorate for local government. So now, every ratepayer and tenant, no matter how low your rate or whatever, had a vote. And also, for the first time, women could vote. Now, there were a few parameters. They had to be, as with the men, the ratepayer, in other words, the head of household, and over 30. But nonetheless, it was a huge expansion in the franchise. And it's worth reflecting on the fact that nowadays we consider the right to vote as akin to a kind of a universal human right. In those times, and for a long time afterwards, it was very much tied into the no taxation without representation, no representation without taxation way of thinking. So that's a whole revolution that's come in our thinking of civic engagement over the generations. So it was the first time, as I say, that women could vote and that women could stand for election. A very small number had got elected in some of the pre-1898 poor law unions, and women could stand for election now, not for the county council, but for their subsidiary rural district councils. And I think there was something like 20 elected around the country in those first 1899 local elections. The election day itself, we just have a report from Newbridge there. We're looking at from the old Liffey Bridge up the street in Newbridge. The polling district for the election of county councillor in the Morristown Biller, or Newbridge, commenced at 10 o'clock on Thursday morning. And this gives us some hard information about the polling. There were 547 voters in the list, and 400 of these came to the poll. Pretty good turnout, including a large percentage of women, who showed a particular anxiety to exercise their right. Very considerable interest was manifested in the proceedings. As was anticipated, no dissension of any kind occurred, and the greatest tranquility prevailed. Nonetheless, the various candidates were working on the old electoral mechanics. Carriages were sent by the different candidates to convey voters from the remote parts of the district. And at 8 o'clock, the poll, which was a rather exhaustive one, was closed. There were 2 booths, and every convenience was provided in the booths for the electorate. And in a sense, it may be, I think, maybe a little bit reassuring that the actual picture of a polling booth and voting hasn't really changed since then. And I know people talk about electronic voting and that in time we should be able to vote with our phones and it might improve the poll, it might get young people more interested and so on. But would it take from the ritual that's involved, the citizen engaging with the system, and so on? So that's just something I'd throw out there. Anyway, the votes were counted in the county courthouse in Naas on the 7th of April. The courthouse, one of the finer architectural adornments of the county town, with its lion and unicorn imperial emblem on its pediment, which I believe remained well into the 1930s, even after Irish Free State and all the rest of it. It was a straightforward count because it was a first past the post vote. Generally, 2 candidates in each electoral division. Some electoral divisions were not contested. I'll come to the PR side of things a little bit later. So there's a map of the outcome of those elections, and just allowing now for, I suppose, a lot of simplification in how we describe the politics. But you can see basically how the Home Rulers took the county pretty much by storm. We only 3 of the Unionist elite who would have sat on the grand jury, and I just named them because there's just 3 of them. Lord Frederick, despite all the critique he got, made it. Sir Gerald Easton Selridge and Mr. Moore O'Farrell in the northwestern extremity of the county. Now we won't go into, but there are their names and so on. There were some co-options because it was the first election. There were some co-options allowed from the old grand jury and things like that. And it was such a momentous occasion that the Leinster leader even hired an artist to make etchings of the newly elected councillors and print them. We're in an era, before photographs became easily available and so on. And the paper, aware of, I suppose, the monumental nature of what was happening in local political terms. A few of those names would still ring true in modern Irish politics, in modern Kildare politics. I would suggest that the E. Hayden in Castledermot may well be in the lineage of Martin Hayden, TD Minister of State in South Kildare. And other names like Malone and Colgan and Field would have registered in the Kildare electoral rolls in the Free State time. So after the elections, there was the celebrations. Mr. Moore O'Farrell was feted by, surprise, surprise, the local fife and drum band to his mansion in Moy Valley. In Kildare town, people still point to the window where John Heffernan, who was elected, made an address to the voters of Kildare when the news came through of his election. So there you are. Little did I think I'd be using Google Street View in a history lecture, but the folks in Kildare swear by that window. And in the extract from the Leinster leader, if you just want the verification, the news of Mr. John Heffernan's election reached Kildare on Saturday evening. A torchlight procession stopped before Mr. Heffernan's house, from the windows of which it was addressed. So there we go. Cassidy is back on the scene. He wins the tussle with Downing and Montstreven. I think he had a lot going for him. Any man who owns a distillery is bound to have a certain advantage in electoral terms. And he rewarded his workmen with a new set of instruments for their brand. Now, back to Frederick Fitzgerald, and after his contention with Ronaldson, there must have been enough old retainers of the Carton estate to propel him ahead of Ronaldson in the count, and he was elected to much excitement. In that we read that Lord Frederick Fitzgerald, despite questions about his commitment to Irish aspirations, was nonetheless elected, and such reservations were put aside by the populace of the town for the Maynooth and Leixlip electoral division. He was met in Maynooth by a brass band, and amid scenes of, quote, wild enthusiasm, was carried to his carriage outside where a procession was formed and escorted all the way to Carton, the crowd cheering vociferously. So an old picture of Maynooth railway station of the Maynooth Brass Band from 1915, some of whom may have even played for Frederick Fitzgerald, and so on. However, his elevation to the county council benches did not go without a kind of a little backhanded message from the guardian of nationalism in the county. The Leinster leader editorialised, Lord Frederick's selection was largely influenced by appeals through the traditions of the Geraldine, aka Lord Edward, as well as by personal worth. And now that the people have chosen him as their representative, it is not too much to hope that he will before long throw in his lot with those who are working to achieve the aims of his distinguished ancestors. So he was certainly getting a message as he took a seat on the council benches. So to bring it more or less up to modern times, election years from 1899 up to the present day. If you're from Kildare, your grandparents and great-grandparents have been voting in 26 local elections to the present day. We're fortunate in Kildare. In some counties in the early 20th century, things fell into such array that the council was suspended and a civil servant from Dublin was put in to run the county. But just a little sort of vestige of Irish political culture. I just picked up that photograph there. 1973 general election. It's by John Minahan, who was raised in Athy but became a celebrated society photographer in London. He was one of the few, if the only, photographer that Samuel Beckett allowed to take a picture of him. And he also was one of the first to take a picture of Lady Diana when her affinity with Charles became known. And I don't think John ever had to doctor any lines or any cuffs didn't line up or anything like that. But when he came home to Athy, John deployed his photographic expertise to pick up aspects of local life. And that's from, you could write a book on that picture alone. The 1973 general election, the small photographs on the left, Liam Cosgrave, and on the right then, a new and up-and-coming Joe Birmingham. And look at that for a slogan. Go, go, go with Joe. I'll tell you, the modern text speak wouldn't be next or near it. And Joe Birmingham, of course, went on, his vote based on, I suppose, on the old rural workers' vote from the strikes and the big farms in South Kildare, and went on to serve several terms, including 2 terms as Minister of State of Office of Public Works. And it was only when I was putting the slide together that I realised that even the telephone box now is a bit of an antique, because they're removing them all, aren't they? Just to say very quickly, 1920, if the Home Rulers in 1899 swept the Unionists aside, we had another churn in the local elections of 1920, when Sinn Féiners and people like, and he's been mentioned several times in this lecture series today, Donald O'Bucala, were elected to Kildare County Council, began passing motions in Irish. One of the first motions they passed was a raising a motion passed in 1916 criticising the Easter Rising. A lot of county councils had to do a quick revision of their minute books in 1920. And also, crucially, if local government was a pioneer in expanding the electorate and the female franchise in 1899, it was a pioneer, again, very rarely remarked in our political culture. Political culture became so attached to the PRSTV voting, vote number 1, number 2. That was introduced first, not for the Parliament elections of 1918, which gave the Dáil, but for the County Council elections of 1920. And afterwards, then, for national national government. 1999, probably the least remarked amendment to the Constitution. Local government wasn't remarked at all, hardly at all, in the 1937 Constitution. So there was an amendment there to ensure that local government elections would take place of intervals of not more than 5 years. Governments had had a habit for postponing them of 7 or 8 when the political temperature wasn't suitable. So now that's why you're having it this June. So 1920, as I say, if I'm invited back to a future set of talks, I'd like to talk about those 1920 elections and how we hear so much about the shooting war in 1920. But the takeover by Sinn Féin of the county councils around the country was instrumental in crippling the sinews of British administration in the districts throughout Ireland. So we come up to modern times, and the councillors currently sitting in the Clay Maynooth electoral area, of which I'm happy to say it's not often you're given a talk about history and you have 2 real life people from that history sitting in the audience, and so on. And some and most and many more of these will be offering themselves at the next election. And finally then, Elaine, probably I'm running over your time. Another minute or 2. We'll finish off with, I said at the start, I probably didn't have an awful lot to offer in terms of the scholarly excellence of the previous three speakers. But I will make a little Geraldine link, starting with Professor Lyons and then Colette, and the relatively new coat of arms of Kildare County Council. And what's it based on? The Fitzgerald Saltire. The red X, the Fitzgerald Saltire. And commissioned by the council in the early 90s. Symbolism reflecting aspects of the county, the crossed swords representing the military tradition, British and Irish, in the county, and heraldic terms, crossed swords represents the end of battle or peace, which reflects the peacekeeping disposition of the modern Irish Defence Forces based on the Curragh. And then the other symbols working anti-clockwise, the St. Bridget's Cross, of course the harp for Leinster, the oak leaves for Kildare, and then the horse. Now, I just need to correct a little bit of urban folklore here. That is not a Garda photo fit of Shergar. It's the heraldic symbol for the equestrian industry. But it does remind me, and I'll finish on this little story, as we mentioned, the whole thing about Shergar, it does remind me about the story that after his kidnapping and so on, and the investigation was headed by Chief Superintendent Murphy, a very accomplished policeman, a man who was small in stature, wore a trilby hat, and so on. And for about maybe 7-10 days afterwards, over in Newbridge, where the investigation was centred, he would give a press conference, which is mostly attended by the UK tabloids. And every other day, Fleet Street's finest did sort of run up to him and say, "Governor, what have you got anything?" And he'd give them some little piece of, And one morning he comes out anyway and he says, "Gentlemen, I'm glad to say there's been a significant breakthrough in the investigation." And they say, "What you got, Governor? What you got?" "I'm glad to say we have a good description of the horse." So that has absolutely nothing to do with local government, but I just thought I'd finish on an equestrian note. So thank you.